So for folks who are joining us, my name is Stephanie Arduini. I'm the Deputy Director of the American Civil War Museum. You're joining us for our largest gathering of people here for our program, so welcome. We know this is a topic that a lot of people are thinking about. It's in the news quite a bit, so we're excited to have a conversation, especially when things are changing so rapidly. All right. As we get going, I'm going to give just a couple of announcements and try to get the housekeeping things out of the way as quickly as possible before I turn it over to our panelists for the program that you are all here for. But we do have some great programs coming up at the American Civil War Museum. Starting this Thursday, we have a book talk featuring the author Eric Wittenberg. So on Thursday, July 9th, we're going to talk about Seceding from Secession, the Civil War Politics and the Creation of West Virginia. And then next Monday is our monthly history happy hour, where Chris Graham, one of our curators, will talk about stressed out supply chains, life in a failed state. And on Monday, July 27th, we're going to have another book talk with the historian Adrian Brettel, who will do a talk on his newly published book, Colossal Ambitions, Confederate Plans for a Post-War World, which is coincidentally the basis of our new exhibit called Southern Ambitions. You can tell they're related, which just opened this past weekend at the American Civil War Museum here in Richmond. So if you can, definitely come and check it out. But we've got a great program for you all tonight. We're going to have conversation for about the first 20 to 30 minutes with our three panelists, Anna Edwards, Kevin Levin, and Brian Palmer. And it is going to be recorded, so that way for folks who weren't able to attend, you'll be able to hear all of the feedback or all of the conversation. But after about the first 20 or 30 minutes, we're going to turn it over to questions from all of you. And because there are so many people here tonight, we're going to ask that you just enter your questions into the chat. And then I'll collect them, try to group similar questions together and field them to the panelists. So go ahead at any point throughout the program, put them in the chat, I'll track them and we'll go from there. One other thing that I will say is that because this topic can and does often invoke some strong feelings in people, I just want to remind everybody that we're here to have a conversation and to learn and hear some new or interesting information. So we just want to encourage people to listen generously with each other. And we were inspired to do this program because we've gotten lots of questions since we've started reopening to the public about people curious about what's been happening with statues around the country, but especially when they see pictures of statues on Monument Avenue. And this most recent chapter of their lives is really dynamic and in some ways very similar to things that have come before and in many ways very different. So we wanted to have a conversation that explores those connections between the past and present and figure out what this means now, what's happening in this current chapter in their lives. So with that, oh, I should also say thank you to Virginia Humanities, whose funding has made this possible, as it's tied to our most recent exhibit over at the White House of the Confederacy about the evolution of the lost cause and creation of historical memory. So once that reopens, which we don't know when that's going to be yet, once it's we're safely able to do so in the midst of the pandemic, please come by and see that. And with that, now I'm going to turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves. And Anna, maybe I'll toss it to you first, if you could introduce yourself briefly.
Sure. My name is Anna Edwards, and I am on staff at the museum as an interpreter, visitor engagement, but I'm also a public historian that's worked on issues related to African American history in Shockoe Bottom for a number of years.
Okay, my turn. Hi, I'm Brian Palmer. I am a journalist based here in Richmond, and I have been involved in research, kind of two issues that are, in my view, kind of two sides of the same coin: neglected historic African American cemeteries and the public funding for Confederate monuments and sites. So that's what I do.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Levin. I am a historian and educator. I'm actually coming to you from Boston, of all places. I lived in Charlottesville, Virginia for 11 years, from 2000 to 2011. And I write mainly about the American Civil War and also, I guess, more specifically, memory of the Civil War. So a lot of my research is focused on monuments. And so about 2 weeks ago, I tweeted out that it would be really nice to be able to fly down to Richmond to take all of this in, to walk Monument Avenue and to see all the changes that have taken place. But of course, because of the pandemic, that wasn't possible. But Stephanie, and I want to thank her for this, responded to me, and we got the discussion going that it might be possible to organize a sort of virtual tour or conversation about Monument Avenue. And the way it played out was I suggested that we get a couple people who live in Richmond, who are following events in Richmond. And I have to admit, it's a little bit selfish on my part because I want to be able to sort of learn from the people who are on the ground in Richmond to get a sense of what's going on. I think we're going to have plenty of time for historians to reflect on where the last few weeks in Richmond Monument Avenue history fits into the broader history of Monument Avenue. But I do think it's an opportune time to talk about, as Stephanie mentioned, just what's going on in Richmond. A lot of us, I include myself in this, I'm just having difficulty wrapping my head around what's happening on Monument Avenue. It's happening so fast. And I think a lot of you who are watching probably feel that way as well. And so I want to try to make some sense of this with the help of Brian and Anna. I think for most of you, or many of you, probably have maybe some sense of what it is we're talking about. There probably is no more significant piece of real estate when it comes to Confederate memory than Monument Avenue, right? We're talking about the monuments, the Robert E. Lee Monument in 1890, the Jeb Stuart and Jeff Davis monuments that were dedicated in 1907, the Stonewall Jackson monument in 1919, and then finally Matthew Fontaine Maury in 1929. A couple of these, the Stuart, Davis that was pulled down by protesters a couple of weeks ago, and then Maury have already been removed. Mm-hmm. So we're pretty much down to the Robert E. Lee on one side, and then of course the final addition to Monument Avenue being the Arthur Ashe monument in 1996. I hope I have that date right, 1996. And so those are the bookends we're working with right now. So it's interesting to think that Arthur Ashe might be the last man standing after all of this is said and done. And we have some photographs that we're going to share as we get this discussion going. But I thought I would just sort of throw out to Anna and Brian, and you guys can take this, I think, any way you want. And that is, I think it's safe to say that, and I've pointed this out a couple times, that we've probably seen more Black Richmonders on Lee Circle in the last 4 weeks than we have the entire 130 years of the life of Robert E. Lee statue. And so much, of course, has taken place, and we can sort of get into that as we go, as we get started, as we go through this discussion. But I just want to throw out to both of you, in terms of what stands out, in terms of the way in which the Lee Circle specifically, but you can focus on other statue locations if you want, what stands out in terms of the way in which the community has rallied around, and I think it's safe to say, taken ownership of these sites for the first time. That seems to me to be probably the most significant development, certainly one that I could not have anticipated 4 weeks ago. So what stands out, I guess, to the both of you? Let's just sort of use that to get us started here.
Anna, you want to?
Well, it's a good question, because that idea of ownership, right? The idea that this city and its civic resources actually belong to the people of the city is a really good thread to talk about, because Monument Avenue has, while it's in its way been a public resource, it's also been a very particular place where the statues, even if you didn't pay attention to them much, carried an air of sanctity. They were treated as if they were untouchable in many ways. And I think emotionally, the way that Black Richmonders have had to live in Richmond, over the course of 150 odd years since the Civil War, has been to deal with reminders that Richmond was not supposed to belong to them, and that these civic spaces were only theirs by either demand, absolute insistence that they be able to take advantage of them, or by permission, as opposed to being people living on an equal footing in the city. So the idea that Black people have come up, and it's primarily young Black people who have suddenly, impatiently and beautifully said, you know what, this city is ours, and we have the right to claim and to say what these things mean to us and have meant to our parents' generations, our grandparents' generations, our enslaved ancestors, what this kind of demarcation in the civic landscape has meant over the years. And I think it speaks to the fact that this avenue and many of its monuments have been contested since the beginning. They have never really peacefully come into the landscape because people have understood what they were intended to represent.
I would second that. The first time I visited Lee Circle, which folks have now rechristened Marcus David Peters Circle, for a gentleman, African-American gentleman, who was killed a little over a year ago during a mental health crisis by Richmond police. It was Lee Jackson J, 2013, and a small group of Confederate reenactors were marching around, and they had a little tent display there, but there was barely anyone there. It felt like a frozen zone, and me and my wife Erin coming into that zone felt like some sort of not quite a confrontation, but I didn't feel welcomed, and I certainly didn't feel like I belonged. So it was this frozen, and as Anna said, contested space. And then just since the beginning of June, that site has become a different kind of contested space, because you have African-American white folks, you have an intersection there of young Richmond and activists and everybody in that space. So you have these times of day, these moments where it's absolutely contested, and there's been some bad energy, violent energy, and then you had that transformation. So you see this picture of Mel Basquiat drawing on the pedestal of the Robert E. Lee Monument. The space now feels, it's going to sound cliche, but it sounds liberated. The space feels liberated. And what I see now when I go to Marcus David Peters Circle, I see families. We just scrolled through the Robinson family. The caption was wrong, but I see families, Black families, posing, even with all the graffiti and all that sort of stuff. The space has been reclaimed in a really beautiful and gentle way. And for all of the politics surrounding this, when is it going to come down, the pepper spray, all of that stuff, I feel rooted there now, because the people have said, listen, these monuments were erected in a completely anti-democratic environment. So we're talking about context, and we're talking about heritage, not hate. They went up during a hateful period when African-American men, because that's who could vote, were disenfranchised overnight, about 90%, right? So that was an occupied space. That monument, these monuments were embedded in that space with African-American taxpayer money. And now African-Americans are not just reclaiming it, but repurposing it. And I have a smile on my face every time I visit.
Yeah, I wonder, first, thanks to my friend Chris Graham for taking care of the photographs that you're seeing. But I wonder if he can go to, there's a slide of some images, some historic images, and I think it might be helpful, it might be helpful just to sort of, as Brian was mentioning, sort of the context, the relevant context, because we are talking about, monuments that we usually think of Confederate monuments as added to a prominent public space like a courthouse or an intersection. In the case of Monument Avenue, these monuments were part of the initial development of the west end of Richmond, which was designated, if you go back and read, ads in the real estate ads in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, you'll see, of course, the restrictive clauses, which of course barred African Americans from buying these lots and building homes. So right from the beginning, this is a wonderful example of the way in which these monuments really did help from the get-go to carve out white space, right? And I think that's an important sort of context to give us sort of the long history here in terms of what we're now seeing. But I guess I want to sort of throw this back, to both of you. I mean, given the way, in which the space has been reclaimed, obviously the monuments are coming down, but the Lee Monument is still there. And obviously, I think it's just a matter of time before it is removed. The injunction will be lifted. I assume for both of you, I'll just throw this out there, that what has transpired over the last few weeks is in a way the last chapter, the final chapter of the Lee statue. But is there a way of maintaining it, or could there be a way of maintaining it as it is, given that it's been reclaimed by so many Richmonders who have, never before really set foot on it or believed it belonged to them? Is there a way to sort of maintain that site as is, or, and again, it will be removed, I don't deny that, or must this be the final, is this a way for Richmonders to let go of it, or at least for Richmonders of a certain generation to let go of this this specific space as it is now constituted? I hope that question made sense.
Yeah. Well, we've had a couple of arguably lesser lettings go with the unceremonious removal of Jefferson Davis, but then the not so ceremonious but still official removal of Stonewall Jackson, and then today Jeb Stuart being carted off. I mean, to me, the actual removals felt like almost pro forma, like the energy that went into getting them down seemed to me to be the point. And in terms of what might happen with Lee, I think a lot of people are going to have to weigh in on that. But Anna, I don't necessarily have a heap of ideas.
Yeah, go for it, Anna. Help us
Well,
out here.
I mean, I think that I agree with you, actually. It's been very interesting the way in which, to a large extent, the monuments have been coming down. With, in spite of this picture with Jackson's statue, there were a lot of people that were there, I think because it was the first one that came down officially. And very, very few people were there for Maury's, statue removal. And I honestly saw maybe even fewer people there for Stuart's removal. So I think it's a very telling thing that what has been expressed has been about what these statues have meant to people simply by being there, and the fact that nobody has felt the full sort of community level ability to actually critique them and transform them in this way over this period. And the fact that it stemmed from a sort of a final sense of outrage over watching a Black man be killed on camera.
Let's not forget that. Yeah.
And then rolls into, from there, it rolls into these problems of killings of Black men that are a tradition in American society, that then are represented by the symbols of racism in our society and in the civic landscape. And those symbols in Richmond are exemplified by the ones on Monument Avenue. So I can't tell you how, in many ways, it's been surreal. Not sure where the ground under my feet actually is, in this moment, because like I said, these have always been contested, but the group that I work with, the Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality, has been talking about this since at least 2007. The UCI World Race sort of centered on Monument Avenue and presented it to the world as the best of the urban landscape that Richmond had to offer. All of these things sort of lead to, again, the meanings that people bring to Monument Avenue. And so, to my mind, no, I don't see, at this moment, I don't see how you could leave Robert E. Lee up there. It would be as though the thought was incomplete. At this moment. I see the pedestals, and in particular, the pedestal that Lee stands on, as truly representing this kind of living transformation of public sentiment, of public patience, of meaning in the landscape. This is a space now that people are not treading lightly on. They are fully engaging it, like you talked about, Brian. So I don't see Lee remaining there, and I do see that there's opportunity for other people to figure out where a statue of Lee or Jackson or Stewart can best, tell their part of the story. But Richmond is now embarking on telling a story that had been left out, that had been described as either non-existent or a marginal story to the civic story. And now it's literally people are making the next chapter of Richmond's history by what they have done to these to the pedestals and to this street.
I was just going to ask, can the two of you help us or help me understand how the last few weeks, Anna, you mentioned that this, certainly we have to remember the killing of George Floyd. That was the immediate catalyst. But as we talked about the other day, and I wonder if you can reflect on this a bit more, the extent to which what's happening in Richmond is connected to broader issues of economic disparity, racial problems. We talked about, of course, the problem of evictions in Richmond recently, or in recent years, perhaps. And I'm wondering, to what extent is this about, how do we understand the intersection between a battle over the past, over history, and the present? Because Richmond obviously has its own unique story, and that's part of what's going on here.
Well,
it's also the nexus of the African-American story in the United States, right? So Richmond has a unique aspect to the story that connects us to Black people across this country. Every city that is going through this kind of transformation has its own unique dynamics in relation to that, but it is a part of the larger story of Black people's lives in this country. And it does, the fact that this was a real estate development plan that had the covenants built into it that Black people couldn't buy there. Well, those covenants didn't only exist on Monument Avenue, they existed around the city.
Right.
So, the principal way in which the American identity is built around the ability to buy a house and build your wealth, in the early years when that was being done by white Americans and given to them as something that they were supposed to anticipate as a right of them being American citizens, this was being systematically, literally, functionally denied to Black people. So they end up behind the curve, for decades. So the people who are reclaiming the spaces that these symbols represent are coming up out of having understood that they grew up and their parents grew up having to wrestle with that. And even in a time when we were, the Civil Rights Acts were passed, we can, everybody can vote, women can vote, there's legislation to enforce that, you still are dealing with, again, having been forced to stay behind the curve for so long that the catch up it can look crazy to people. And it certainly feels it when you have to go through it.
And I think that's a great point, Anna, because for me, I see how these monuments became vectors, targets for rage. So it was George Floyd's killing by Minneapolis police, which exploded across the country, around the world. But then it was Richmond Police Department's rather brutal response to peaceful protest. And, you know, this was not just Black people. All that tagging that you see, and these monuments have been tagged before. The BLM here, a little bit of that there, but Chris just zipped by the headquarters of the United Daughters of the Confederacy was attacked, and fire set apparently on the inside. I mean, there was rage. There was tremendous rage, and these edifices, these monuments have been here forever. We've passed them. We've looked at them. We know what they stand for. People know what they stand for. So all that graffiti, that just wasn't Black kids. I mean, I was following one rally, and there was this one white kid spray painting BLM on everything. I think that we can't discount the rage. And I think it's rage at Trump. I think it's rage at systemic racism. I think it's all sorts of pent up anger. And that all got easily, or not easily, but rapidly focused on these sites that, as Anna was saying, these were white spaces. They had been defined as white spaces. So they were almost like the antithesis of what we're trying to create now.
I wonder if, I know Stephanie's going to have some questions for us in a bit. So Stephanie, just jump in. But I guess whether we have time to answer this, but maybe just think about it, or maybe we have a few minutes. I mean, and this sort of builds on your point, Brian, about sort of just the way in which this anger, this rage was so focused. I remember waking up, I think it was a Saturday morning, and looking at that video of the fire coming out of the UDC building. I had to sort of look away and just, what am I looking at? It was just so strange to me. I had to do a double take. And I guess my question is, how do you think the city will be able to focus in a way that really does recreate these spaces, these public spaces, in a way that does now finally reflect the collective values, the sort of a collective memory, if you will, of the entire city? Will that be difficult? What are the challenges moving forward in sort of the next chapter of these spaces? Because I think you guys make a good point that, yeah, the statues have come down, but these pedestals, especially the Lee, if they choose to keep it there, that's a significant piece of the puzzle, right? I mean, you know, they tower over you as you approach, regardless of the angle. So I'm wondering, you know, what are the challenges moving forward in sort of focusing as much of that attention as possible? It's easy to tear down. I just wonder to what extent it's going to be, what challenges the city faces rebuilding.
Well, just two quick things. So that tsunami of rage, at least for the moment, seems to have dissipated. But what has taken its place seems even bigger, which is that desire to fill the vacuum, to create what's next, which you see at Lee Monument. What I fear is, being a cynical journalist, is the co-optation, however you say that word, of what the George Floyd protests were about. And I do see politicians saying, sort of dealing with some semi-seriousness the problem of police reform, police brutality, which continued throughout the protests, and then doing the kind of like, look, the monuments, we're taking them down. And that's an important thing, but it's a mostly symbolic step in a much larger program. We need a comprehensive program to address the fundamental issues, generational poverty, and police brutality, the very thing that sparked the protest in the first place. So what will happen, what I'm hoping, is that there will be some coalescence of that post-rage energy, which will be constructive and educational and wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, look, we have Anna Edwards on this program.
Yeah.
I mean, Anna, you were involved in the future of Richmond's past. I mean, one of the things we can say about Richmond is it's done quite a bit of work over the last, decade or two. We can think of the Civil War 150th, right, in which the city was really finding creative ways to broaden the historical narrative, right? And so maybe we are a little bit too, or maybe I am a little bit too pessimistic, but I mean, it seems like the pieces are in place for something really quite creative and reflective of, the broader
Sure.
Richmond community.
I mean, I think if you're there are a couple of things to think about. One is that none of these things, in many ways, this has been what you would call like an overnight success, right? For 150 years, people have been dealing with the feelings that symbols like this have represented because they are living the experiences of the inequities, right, in society all of that time. But the thing they have to look at every day that reminds them of that, is a monument or a sculpture or something in the public space. So now that they're coming down and the space is being cleared, then we have this really remarkable opportunity. But it's not just one opportunity. I think what I want to, remind us of is that even these monuments went up over, a 40-year period. So we are talking about an opportunity for us to consider the intersection of concrete issues with how we represent what those mean to us in the public sphere. And so, I know that there are entities that are already talking about what could replace them. And, the immediate thought is you replace them with other figures that represent the values that you would like to see. Figures that weren't valued at the time, the United States Colored Troops, for example, or Elizabeth Van Lew and Mary Richards. There's a whole bunch of people. There's the Native American history that hasn't been acknowledged, and not just the history before Europeans got here, but the role of Native Americans in Richmond, over time as well. So we're looking at an opportunity where the Black struggle, and in many ways, embodies the struggles of lots of marginalized people. And when we help clear that space, we help create the opportunity for what could come next. So Monument Avenue has been rather beautifully the target of an imagined, a conceptual competition for what it could be that was hosted by the Valentine Museum and MOB on Broad Street, the storefront. Anyway, there are these other organizations that have put these things together to help us sort of break out of the sort of narrow range of thinking that we have about Monument Avenue. It's like, are we going to go get somebody else and put them on a horse and put them back on Monument Avenue? Or are we going to really think about the Richmond that we want it to be? Are we going to think more aspirationally? Are we going to think more commemoratively about what we actually want to mark in our history? One of the best things I think is that people have, I think in a very knee-jerk way, people have tended to say things like, you're erasing history. Well, the history that might be erased is simply the physical presence of that monument or that sculpture on Monument Avenue at that moment. But what you are creating in the same breath is the history of this moment. This is what is actually happening in Richmond, and this is what is actually happening in communities across the country. And I really want to emphasize that, as Brian was really trying to point out, or was pointing out, is the fact that we do this with our symbols, but it won't mean very much if we aren't making the fundamental changes that need to happen at the structural systemic level in our society. And I firmly believe that's what people are looking for. That's what people are we're in a quiet moment, but I think people want to see that the structural changes are concretely on their way. We don't want to hear from our politicians that, oh, cool, look what we did. The monuments are down. Now we can settle down a little bit and get back to business, and we'll get to those things. The problem is that by saying we'll get to those things is really precisely what led us to this moment.
Stephanie, do you want to jump in? Any?
So we've had a lot of questions. Thank you all for those that have been submitting them. I'm trying to organize them and make sure I represent them well. We had some questions based on, Anna, what you were just saying about this idea of why do these have to come down? Talking about this idea of, does this erase history? Why can't we just add more statues to what's already there? Could you all speak a little bit more about that?
May I say something quickly? These statues are the eraser. These statues were erected to erase the communal experience of African Americans. They were deployed as weapons. So for example, if you know that in 1890, and this is something that Chris Graham and I have talked a lot about, and he's given me a deeper understanding of it, but John Mitchell Jr., a man born enslaved, who was the editor of the Richmond Planet, which was one of the most vigorous and militant Black newspapers in the country at the turn of the century. He was on the Common Council, a Black man, formerly enslaved person on the Common Council. He would not vote yes to fund that monument, and he covered the unveiling of that monument in May of 1890, and he had some very choice quotes about the symbolism of erecting Robert E. Lee there as a monument to this myth of states' rights. But what I was trying to say before is that these monuments went up in a program of disenfranchisement and domestic terror and erasure and marginalization of African American citizens. So they don't represent history. What they represent is ideology. What they represent is propaganda. So you really need to understand that series of laws that led to the disenfranchisement of 90% of African American men from 1894, the Walton Act, to the 1902 Constitution. That's history. That's the history. The fact that these monuments were put up by Black men, that's the history. Chris Graham shared a great quote with me from John Mitchell Jr. He said, Black people put these monuments up and they're going to take them down. That's the history. So understand that Jeb Stuart came down today. So in 1907, the city council allocated $15,000 for that statue, $15,000. So that's between $300,000 and $400,000 in 2019 money. Public money, taxpayer money, my ancestors who could not vote. That's the history. Right across town, you have an African American cemetery that had not been funded forever, several of them. All of that money going to Confederate sites and Confederate places, state money, $9 million to Confederate cemeteries between 1902 and about 2017, and nothing going to African American cemeteries where the people who they fought to enslave and their children were buried. That's the history. So I would say, let's put that in the standards of learning. Let's put that in the classrooms. And then we can put these things in context. But you don't understand history if you don't understand how these things got there in the first place.
Yeah, one of the things that I remember from time to time is that I have one of my very good friends many years ago apparently was really, she didn't understand. And she asked me one day, she says, I don't understand why Black people are mad at me. And, you know, and so it was clear, you know, we had a long conversation. We had many, many conversations because she was my good friend. But it was clear that she had not had the experience and not even lived close enough to other Black people to understand that there was a historical reason why she might bump into somebody who didn't necessarily treat her politely, right? Because in that moment, the two of them represented this long-standing dynamic between Black and white people. you know, we can talk about, and we, you know, it's important to acknowledge the alliances that have also gone on. The fact that Black and white people have worked to end, you know, racism and worked for civil rights and for Black liberation in the 70s. And in South Africa, you know, this is a much, much bigger story that we are a part of. And so it's really important to talk about all aspects of that. And it's very difficult to actually learn from historical markers like these monuments that only tell and literally, as you say, erase an accurate representation of history. So, you know, it was time. They had their lifespan. They literally served the purpose they were intended to serve, and the purpose is done. And the people have finally, Black and white, rose up and said, we can't wait for you to decide that your political career can handle you being bold enough to say that the monuments need to come down. The time is now. And so they took it in their own hands. And the other thing that I really think is important to point out is that all of this rage that you have been talking about has been poured out on inanimate objects. And yet the violence that has been experienced by protesters and by those people who took their rage out on inanimate objects, that has been directed on their bodies, on people. And those people, and there are people now who have lost their lives because the response to property damage was human life. And that is something that really has to be examined.
And there's a wonderful photograph. I think it's the Jeff Davis Memorial with, I think it must be the Ladies of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And there are children, I think Chris will bring this up, but I think it helps to make an important point that these monuments were part of a much larger project. I mean, they go up at a time when the veterans themselves are dying off. So there is this, this push to honor them in various ways. One of the ways obviously is dedication of monuments. But children are probably central to this lost cause project at the turn of the 20th century, because you're looking at the kids who did not experience the war. They didn't live through what white Southerners would have referred to as the horrors of Reconstruction. And so these monuments serve to educate them as young white Southerners who need to sort of rise up and carry on the project of maintaining the racial status quo. And I think, to build on both Anna and Brian, these monuments go up, you know, at the time that Virginia rewrites its state constitution, again, disfranchising the largest segment of the Black population. And they're being educated, these young kids, around the idea that the Confederacy was a gallant fight, that it had nothing to do with the preservation of the institution of slavery and white supremacy, and that African Americans, right, were loyal to the Confederacy from the beginning to end. So these monuments do, in fact, erase history because, of course, they mythologize it, right? They erase it because the story of African Americans and the desire to be free and the fight for freedom is a threat in the early 20th century to what they're trying to do right here, which is construct a culture of white supremacy, right? Through the building of these monuments.
And what happens when you teach generations of children that they are entitled and superior, and you teach other children that they are unentitled and inferior? That's a lot of psychological damage that's being done and passed forward.
Well, and then also, that narrative has contaminated the culture through the present moment for a particular reason. And it is because that has been a very robust and dominant narrative with white folks always at the center of things. But there's always been a parallel narrative of African-American resilience, and Indigenous folks can say the same thing, Chicano folks can say the same thing, API folks can say the same thing. But we've been fed that gone with the wind kind of inflected version of American history. That's the dominant narrative. We have to have the courage to look for those parallel narratives. We have to read the Richmond Planet. We have to understand Anna's work and Phil's work, what's going on in Shockoe Bottom.
That's right.
Again, that's where the history is. But I think we have to recognize the incredible damage that has been done to our culture, and as Anna was saying, to white and Black people, because this lost cause, toxicity has been romanticized, and it has corrupted our culture to the point where we need to unlearn a lot of things.
I'm going to jump in here. You guys have answered like 5 questions all in a row.
That's how we roll.
That's great. So we're talking about the lost cause and education and what we are thinking about, what we want to remember, what we want to remember differently. So there were a couple of questions that came in about, well, how do we tell stories about people like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Jeb Stuart? Is it important to remember them? What can we learn from them? How do we talk about them? How do we teach them?
I mean,
Well, first you take them off their pedestals.
Yeah.
I think that's largely it. I mean, there are plenty of problematic people in history. And what you do is you put them in the context in which they belong. Robert E. Lee's context was, before and during the Civil War, and his life, after at Washington and Lee University. His life was not up on a pedestal like this, right? So the story of this monument is a different story than Robert E. Lee's role, specifically in history. And if you're going to tell the story of Robert E. Lee or any of these other people, you are going to tell it within the context in which they acted and in which their roles had an effect on, American history. There's no problem with that. It's the glorification, it's the desire of people to cling to a kind of set of meanings that at the end of the day, I don't know what they mean. To a large extent, I can't say what they mean to somebody else. That's not fair, that's not right. But what I know that when I think about historical figures, it's because I want to understand the roles that they played in their moment that contributes to the place that I live in, right? And so nobody's saying, don't talk about Robert E. Lee. He's not persona non grata in that way. He is somebody that you should understand, because the Confederacy rose up and tried to leave the country. And there are all kinds of dynamics that has an effect on, including the economics that follow. Again, you teach them like you teach any other historical figure, but I think the other aspect is that we have a great many more resources for accessing historical documentation, getting a better sense of historical accuracy, and being able to hopefully, talk through and understand what those histories actually are and what they actually mean. So I expect education is going to start to transform. It's going to look different going forward as we try to tell a more accurate history.
And we've never been better positioned as educators to be able to tell these stories, given the kinds of primary sources that are now available, digital sources of various kinds. And I think you're absolutely right, Anna. It's such an important point. I mean, part of actually approaching these men as historical figures is to get beyond the mythology. And I think we have that problem with any number of historical figures, even beyond the Civil War. But you study Robert E. Lee, you study Stonewall Jackson, Davis, because of their impact on what in fact happened, especially in the 1860s. You can't make any sense of the way in which the war evolved militarily if you don't understand what Lee accomplished, what Stonewall Jackson accomplished, and the limitations of their accomplishments in the Richmond area itself, right? I mean, if you think about just the connection between the military situation in the summer of 1862 and the fall of 62 and its connection to emancipation, right? I mean, they're all they all overlap, they intertwine, and we need to understand all of that. I mean, it's frustrating, I think, sometimes to hear people say, well, we don't need to think about them at all. That removing the monument, I think for some people, is a kind of erasing it from not just sort of public memory in the public space, but having to think about him at all. And that's the wrong move. I mean, that's at least me wearing the educator's cap for a second. But go ahead, Brian.
What I would say is that I would like to step away from the great man approach to history for a little while, because just in my own personal experience, discovering the lives of people who were not prominent, my own great-grandparents, and learning that these two individuals, Julia Fox Palmer and Matt Palmer, they self-emancipated. They liberated themselves. They were part of another tsunami of a huge self-liberation of 500,000 African Americans before the end of the Civil War. So I want to understand that. I want kids to understand that. I want white kids, but I want Black kids to understand that before I bother about Robert E. Lee. Put him in context, great. But for me, the power comes in knowing that my blood freed itself and that they weren't alone, that they were connected to hundreds of thousands of people, and they fought for their own freedom. They served the United States, even when the United States didn't serve them. That to me is the most powerful thing about being American that I've learned in my lifetime, and certainly since moving to Virginia.
A great point.
And I'll just throw in too, I think one of the most impactful things that's also happened over the last, say, 25 years or so is the effect of genealogy. And that's across the board. Yes. But, you know, African-American genealogy and genealogy as a whole has helped people understand their own families' trajectories through an American history. And I think people are learning then what it meant on the ground to be part of different historical moments. And that's important, and it's a lot more sort of leveling on the one hand, because it means we all know that we have this wide range of experiences that are all valid as experiences, but also that we have this sense of empowerment and connection because we know that our people have been a part of this process all along and have the right and the ability to weigh in on what it means now, and therefore what we want to see going forward.
So I'll chip in and say that there have been a lot of questions that look at how this conversation in many ways is not new, since there are some people who cited dissent about these statues, and you all have mentioned that from the beginning. And to what degree, especially Black Virginians or Black Richmonders were able to demonstrate that dissent during the middle of Jim Crow with kind of the violence and intimidation of that era. But
I wish we had that one image. I don't know which collection it's from. Might be the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. But it's an Emancipation Day march down Broad Street.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I wish we had that, only because it sort of serves as a reminder that even through this period, that these monuments on Monument Avenue and elsewhere, there you go, the power of the internet. That even though, of course, they erase this this emancipationist memory that African Americans still embrace decades after the war, that, you know, again, it might be sort of erased from the public space. It's certainly not forgotten by African Americans themselves. I don't remember what the date is on this. I'm sure
1905.
Yeah, I knew the year, roughly the year. I wasn't sure what month. Yeah, there's 1905.
It was
but
probably
it's incredibly
April
powerful,
3rd.
right?
It was either April 3rd or it was January 1st.
Right, and I think what stands out to me, and I use this in my class every year, I have my students interpret this. Is it Broad Street? Am I right about that? Yeah, I mean, just the different generations that you see here. I mean, it's just so striking. And you think of sort of the bravery at work here that's present, right? Yeah. It is a kind of snub, you know, in the face of white Richmonders. We're still here, right?
And that was also during the streetcar boycott, right? 1904, roughly 1906.
Good point.
But I would say, just to that question about opposition to the monuments, I think Black folks were fighting the fights that they could, and they were fighting the fights that were most important, like trying to get a job and put food on the table. So Sean Mitchell Jr. was a newspaper man, so he had to write about it. But I think most other folks were just fighting Jim Crow and living their lives.
Yeah. There are some other. Well, go ahead, Anna. Go ahead.
Yeah.
That was me, Kevin. Go ahead. Say your thought.
Sorry, I was just going to point out there are other examples. I mean, you can go. I'm not sure what year in the 1960s, where students at Tuskegee protested the murder of an African American man, and vandalized, committed some damage to the monument in the square, in Tuskegee, Alabama. And so there are other examples like that. But I think Brian, your point is well taken. That you might have to look elsewhere for the kinds of pushback, that African Americans were engaging in their own communities, et cetera.
I've got a question that I'm going to save till the end there. What
a great photograph.
Yeah. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, because we had a lot of people saying that they've been thinking about, okay, if these statues are coming down, what else happens? Is it a place that's for public gathering and discourse? Are there new people that go up on these? Do we leave the plinths as they are, empty, or even as they currently appear, equated to kind of like a piece of the Berlin Wall that has another layer of history and context added to that? What are all your thoughts or reactions to what happens next?
Well, I have that feeling very much about the Lee Monument, partly because its transformation through graffiti and imagery has been so profound and is ongoing. It just sort of became more and more beautiful every day that I went by and saw it. And so for me, and I wasn't thinking about the Berlin Wall, but again, the way that it captures this moment, and it captures a full range of feelings. There's incredible rage, there is incredible grief, there is incredible love. All of this is there. And so, and I don't know if we mentioned it before, but not only the markings, but there literally are small markers dedicated to Black people, young Black men, women, and children who have been killed either by the police or other people. So it became a place of memorial and respect at the same time. And that transformation is profound. And I personally would like to see that plinth or pedestal either stay for a while. Because I do think that reimagining and determining what is going to happen, in terms of other monuments and public art in general, I think those ideas are already, sort of roiling around people's minds. But I think the most important thing maybe is that this has finally become a public space that everyone activates, that everyone is drawn to and feels that they not only can be there, but that they contribute to, that there's a real expression of civic engagement and personal connection by being there, by having a picnic there, by handing out information, by registering to vote while you're there, by getting paperwork that helps former felons get their rights back so that they can vote, right? There's a real sense of understanding about what our rights are supposed to be as American people that's kind of playing out there. And I would say it's a moving target. I'm not interested in defining what should happen next. I think that we are watching and participating, all of us, in what is going to happen next.
Yes. I think we should also be able to hold 2 or 3 things in our heads at the same time and not mix them up. So what happens to the monuments, great, let's talk about that. But there's as Kevin mentioned at the beginning, we have a local and a national crisis of evictions that is coming down the pike at the end of this month. I mean, dire state. People are going to be thrown out of their homes, and all of these special COVID-related payments are going to end. Like, that is now. That's happening right now. And there were people who were protesting that as Stonewall was coming down, and they were getting pepper sprayed. So they are connected. And I think we have to be able to, on one track, say, okay, this is going to be the reasonable way and the reasonable thing to do about these monuments in terms of education. But these statues became vectors for rage, targets of rage for a reason. And let's work on some of those reasons now. Like, how are we going to work with grassroots groups like Richmond for All, New Virginia Majority, to do something about these people that are going to be thrown out on their, thrown out of their homes? Let's talk about a rent moratorium. Let's talk about rent cancellation. Let's talk about these things that affect people's lives that are not symbolic but are vital.
Right.
I have 4 kind of clumped together questions that are left, if that's okay with everybody. Since these were fairly popular questions, I want to get them in. Is that okay with everybody's time here?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So there were a bunch of questions that were looking at the act of adding the paint to the statues and that fine line between vandalism and a crime, if it's publicly defacing public property, in comparison to civil disobedience. And what does that mean for how we talk about that precedence for other things? How would you respond to this idea of, well, this is a crime, or I get the idea, but I don't like the way that this is happening?
I would just say, sorry, I would just say that I've been thinking a lot about that. And I think that also comes down to holding a number of different things in your head at once. So they became targets of rage because they were evil symbols, and that were part of a genuinely evil movement that tried to negate the humanity of African Americans. So I fall short of judging these people for defacing and so on and so forth, because I understand that history. So am I roiled? Am I conflicted? But I got, when I read F12 and other things, but when I see Mel Basquiat drawing Huey P. Newton and Malcolm X on the pedestal of Robert E. Lee, I feel kind of good. So, I mean, I have to think long and hard, but I think that's what we have to do. That's what's so exciting. Like, that's what revolution, liberation is. Sorry to cut you off, Anna.
That's all right. I was going to say that's what uprisings do, right? Yeah, it's not tidy. And, it calls into question the civic, again, the civic condition. This is a particular moment. And as you say, it's an expression. And these are not neutral spaces. And they're not, it's not, that whole idea of like level playing field. Okay, yes, in the theoretical world and in sort of an objective way of talking about things, you can say, maybe it's not a good idea that people have permission to simply do whatever they want to public art. Absolutely. But we're not talking about generally defacing public art. We are talking about a true social uprising that we have described here tonight. So, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I don't have much to add, except that maybe sort of a broader international context might help some people. I mean, it certainly has helped me over the past few years. Traveling for the first time in a city like Prague and being able to see the spaces where those large monuments to Stalin and Lenin once stood, the monuments to communism, many of which are now in museums. But you can see, of course, the spaces that, they're constantly spray painted over with various messages, monuments that are still up. It's not uncommon to find that they are targeted, tagged. And I think it speaks to the fact that we do have to understand them as political in nature, right?
Yes.
It's not just public art.
Right.
And so that has helped me understand to sort of work through some of the issues that I've needed to work through when it comes to our own monument landscapes.
And I don't think we would have that beautiful family-oriented, liberated space had we not gone through that more radical phase.
Yeah, and just to add one more point, I mean, there is that moment after the Declaration of Independence is read, in New York City, where one of the first acts of revolution is the pulling down of a, equestrian statue of King George, right? And it is part of the broader process, right? Of I guess democracy, or what happens when there are sudden shifts in power, right?
Oh,
You have to really remember that that monuments are physical objects that mark a particular moment, and there's no guarantee that they will be there in perpetuity.
That's right. There's nothing necessarily timeless about a monument, right? They anchor us in various ways, and that can be unsettling when they are removed. But there's nothing about a monument that is, again, timeless.
I wanted to say that picture is of the Robinson family. So 2 daughters taking a picture of parents and the gorgeous little baby.
And I'll also shout out that many of these photos are Brian's photos that he's been taking over the time there. There have been some questions about that I will follow up with you about, Brian.
Okay.
So we had a couple of questions about about other countries outside of the United States pulling down statues or asking questions about statues or other kinds of iconography where people are questioning the values that those things represent in their current society.
So you mean Christopher slave trade, Christopher Columbus? Yeah, I mean, vectors of rage, right? Or targets of rage about. I mean, we've been fed a triumphalist ideology with figures like Christopher Columbus. And, if you are an indigenous person, a Taino person, you know that it's a lie. And other people now know it's a lie. So a spark is ignited and these things become targets. A slave trader in England, Christopher Columbus here and in other places. It just, that kind of makes sense to me. And what Anna was talking about before, I mean, here it is the pent-up anger of African Americans and others. And in other places, I think Afro-Britons and indigenous people saying enough already. And now that there's a movement behind them that wasn't there before, these radical acts can happen. And I think, again, let's hold that complexity in our mind, that these were ideological, or as Kevin said, these were political statements embedded in our common landscape. And now you have people saying, these were political statements embedded in our common landscape, and we're not going to stand for that anymore, or that particular statement.
Yeah. Go ahead, Anna, you want to add? I mean,
no, that was good.
So we had a question, or a couple of questions about where the statues that are removed go from here. And a common thing that we hear as a museum professional, I hear this a lot, put them in a museum. That's a place where you can add context around them and talk about them. Thank you to the person who said that they recognize that museums don't always have the resources to accept these and care for them properly. But how are any of you aware of places that have moved them to a different location in a way that worked really well?
Yeah, I think the best example is the University of Texas at Austin. So this is going back to, I think it's after the shootings in Charleston. I think it goes back that early, where there were a number of statues on the campus that were removed. A Robert E. Lee statue, one to Davis, and the Davis statue is now exhibited. I think it's in the library building, or one of the library buildings at on campus, and obviously it is contextualized. Classes meet, so that's one example. But I guess to speak to the larger issue, I mean, I think there are a number of things that have to be considered right now, and that is, obviously, a lot of museums are just opening back up. A lot of museums are going to have much larger issues about just keeping their doors open over the next few years. I mean, forget about whether or not you want to acquire a monument or a statue. Many of them are much too large to probably to place in a museum. There was talk perhaps about, if the Emancipation Group or Freedmen's Memorial in DC comes down, that it could be placed in the African American Museum in DC. Certainly they have the space, but I guess another question that sort of emerges here is, does a museum want to become the new front line in this debate about the memory and meaning of Confederate statuary? And I think that's a question that individual museums are going to have to ask themselves. So I think people, and I'm certainly not, I don't work in a museum, but I certainly know plenty of people who do and who work in the field of public history. I think there are a number of challenges that the average person probably isn't quite aware of when it comes to thinking about moving some of these things inside. It certainly can be done, but it does present a number of challenges.
I heard that there is a park in Russia. I think it's
Budapest.
Russia.
There's one.
Yeah.
There's one in Budapest. Yeah.
Somebody
Exactly.
shared that in the chat that I'll share out to the whole group.
Yeah.
An article.
Okay.
There you go.
Basically, a place to retire unwanted,
A graveyard, if you
unwanted or outdated. Yeah, a graveyard for monuments. It's a public park.
Yeah.
I don't know how I feel about that really, but that's certainly something that, that was an idea that some group of people decide was an appropriate way to handle problematic iconography.
Yeah. I mean, one other solution, and I don't know if it really is a solution, is the Sons of Confederate Veterans are, I don't know if their new quote unquote museum has been opened in Tennessee, but I have heard some rumblings about wanting to find ways to bring some of these removed statues to the grounds. And I don't know if I necessarily have a problem with that. Certainly they would not be interpreted in a way in which, say, the American Civil War Museum would interpret a Confederate statue. But it does seem like the right place for it in terms of, look, these were intended to be revered, right? I mean, one of the difficulties of, I think, contextualization from the get-go is it's very difficult to turn an object that was intended to be venerated into a classroom, right? And so I guess you kind of bypass that problem by giving it to the SCV and letting them just sort of put it either inside their building or the surrounding grounds, and let the people who are inclined to visit a museum organized by the Sons of Confederate Veterans, leave it to them.
I would have
I don't
to.
know. I mean, I'm just throwing that out. I don't know how I really feel about that, but
I would have to object to that, Kevin.
Go for it, Brian.
Largely because of that, the hundreds of thousands of dollars of my ancestors' taxpayers' money. So, I would like these monuments to be a subject, or maybe to be the starting point for the conversations that we're talking about the historical context, and then robust conversation among equal citizens. And then everything should be on the table, from putting them in museums to melting them down and turning them into things that we can actually use.
Yeah, maybe turning them into dust is the right sort of way to go. I mean,
but we should talk, and we should hash this stuff out. We should talk, get everything out, feelings, but mostly facts, and then come what may.
Yeah.
So with that, I'd like to kind of wrap everything up by asking one final question. And we had some people who were just asking, so where else can I go and learn more about statues, about individuals, about memory, about the UDC, about the Lost Cause? People are curious and hungry for more. And we've certainly seen that from visitors coming to the museum. People
go to Chris's
book. I want to address a couple of specific questions that I heard before I open your recommendations. So the American Civil War Museum, in collaboration with the Valentine, the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and the Library of Virginia, our collections have the vast majority of the documents related to the creation of these statues. So in 2017, we put them together into this resource that Chris is sharing there on monumentav.com. And that has a whole bunch of things from the resources that talk about the creation of the statues, but also things that talk about the evolution of that space, suggested resources and readings related to a lot of things that people were asking, including podcasts and videos and things like that. We'll probably put a link to this talk up there also, but that's a great way to go. It also has a lot of primary sources. So for those of you who are educators and looking for resources to use in your classroom, this has excerpts of a lot of people's voices from the beginning, from multiple perspectives, all the way up to the present. And we're in the process of updating this. And it's crazy challenging updating this when so much is evolving so quickly and trying to capture that, but we're doing our best. So check there and some other resources that we're working on. And for the person who wanted more about Matthew Fontaine Maury, there's a blog post about him that talks about why people wanted a statue of him and some of the other conversation. And we just published a most recent blog post about that too. And come to our new exhibit that talks about Maury and his vision for a Confederate influence on the global stage. So with that, Brian, Anna, Kevin, what else do you recommend?
Well, I think it's a great starting place. I really do, because it's incredibly rich set of resources. And I think, you know, sort of whatever perspective or whatever question you start with, I think that you're going to find a place to go from this, you know, from this resource. If I started trying to list all the books that that could illuminate it, I mean, the one thing I always say, I like to remind people, and Brian touched on it, is don't look for the simple answer. Don't go looking for the one, you know, solution. It's all complicated, and you're going to find a lot of information that's going to help you understand the complexity of feelings and experiences that will inform, you know, kind of where we are with this. So, you know, if you find one book, please at least read 3 others. If you watch one YouTube video, please, you know, watch at least 15 others. Yeah.
I would say, yes to all of this. This is a wonderful place to start. I've used this in my own classroom, some of my own research. So it's a great place to start. I would also say, just to kind of take this in a slightly different direction, that if this public discussion debate has sort of reminded us of anything, it's that monuments and memorials are important. And maybe it's an opportunity to sort of springboard from this and look at what's in your own community, right? I mean, we all live in communities, or at least we're very close to communities, where there are, in a public space, there are monuments and memorials. And it might be interesting just to sort of play around and you know, maybe you've never really sort of looked into what the memorial is. And it might be just an opportunity to get a sense of what's in your local area. And to ask the questions that, you know, we've been asking tonight and others have been asking over the last few weeks and beyond. Are they still relevant? What message do they send? You know, is it time to think about, you know, creating some news in your own community and proposing, you know, some kind of change in the public landscape? So I find these topics to be fascinating because, you know, what I tell my students is that these monuments reflect who we take ourselves to be, right? They are supposed to reflect our common past, our collective past, and our common values. And so what's in your own community? Maybe this is a way to sort of, you know, broaden the question of the discussion.
I think it's also good to look at contemporary or accounts contemporary with the erection of the monument. So if you go back and read the Richmond Times-Dispatch or the Alexandria Gazette, in the same newspaper, you'll see headlines like "Negro lynched for the usual crime." That was a 1907 headline. So you'll get a sense of what we've been talking all night about, the environment from which these monuments issued. And then you can also read the Richmond Planet, and you can read what John Mitchell had to say very courageously about the Lee Monument. So reading in the time period, I think, can be very helpful.
Yeah, go to Chronicling America. Just
Yeah.
Google that, and that's a easily accessible, and you can read in forever.
Yes.
Folks who've been asking more about John Mitchell Jr., Chronicling America and looking up past issues of the Richmond Planet, paired with the Encyclopedia of Virginia
And
article.
the Fighting Editor, which is his
And there is a
biography.
book about
The Fighting Editor.
in my library, but there is a recent. I think Anne Alexander wrote a biography about Mitchell, which is actually pretty good. You'd be able to still find it.
Yeah, it's called The Fighting Editor.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank
all
you.
for your time. Thank you all for coming and participating in our conversation. If you do have any questions, I'll put my email in the chat and you're welcome to send them to me. But please, I encourage you to follow us on social media for more resources as we release them and work on them. But thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Have a great night.
Thank you.